Hello, and welcome to our Author Spotlight. I'm Eleanor Hayes. I am honored that award-winning icon Neil Zurcher is with us today. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, Eleanor, and just a pleasure to be back with you again.
Thank
We
you
haven't
very
been on
much.
a set together in, gosh, how many years?
It's been a few years,
Been a few.
enough time to give you a chance to write some books.
Absolutely.
And make a few more one-tank trips. Neil, clearly, as a longtime Cleveland reporter, and with your time at WJW and all of the one-tank trips, you have seen so much of Northeast Ohio and also of Ohio. What prompted your interest in going out and exploring areas that other people might not know about?
Well, as you know, Eleanor, all those years I was working at Channel 8, I was doing one-tank trips for the most part. But a lot of people don't know that the first 25 years that I worked in television, I was just a hard news reporter on the street. And those years had kind of gone by, and I'd gone on to find one-tank trips, and I was enjoying that. I really did. I had a great time doing it, but after I retired the second time from Fox 8, I was sitting at home one day, and I happened to be going through some old notes. And I found this story many years ago. You remember Mickey Flanagan, our assignment editor? Mickey knew that I didn't particularly like animals. And so every time there was an animal story, he would assign me to it. And it was just Mickey's little joke, I guess. And one of the stories in the 1970s he signed me to was to ride an elephant from Peninsula, Ohio, up to the Richfield Coliseum. And while I'm riding this elephant, which I hated to do, but if you've ever ridden an elephant, if you remember, they're no fun to ride. They're big, I don't want to fall underneath one. In any event, while we're walking along to the Richfield Coliseum, this handler from the circus was talking to me. And he said, "Did you ever hear about the big fire that almost destroyed the Ringling Brothers Circus? You know it happened here in Cleveland." And I said, "Really, when?" And he said, "During World War II. And I said, "Do you know about it?" And he said, "No." He said, "It happened after I came with the circus, but you really ought to look it up and think about a story." And I said, "I would." So I made a little note in my notebook and forgot about it. And of course, now, many years later, I'm retired and I'm sitting around home doing nothing, and I found this note, and I thought, well, I'll look it up. In August of 1942, Ringling Brothers came to town, and they put their tents up at East 9th and Lakeside. And when they did, they also put up a huge tent as big as the Big Top, which was their menagerie. And inside they had the elephants, they had the horses, camels, giraffes, every imaginable kind of animal. At around 11 o'clock in the morning of August 4th, the thing caught fire. And it burned so quickly that many of the animals perished in the fire. And it was just incredible. I mean, the story, as I went into these old newspapers and found them, I was just shocked that nobody had written about this story or anything had been done about it. And I couldn't find any books about it or anything. And that was what made me think, well, maybe I should write a story. And so I started writing about that. And then I started remembering other stories that I had covered that also were kind of disappearing in the history of sands of history, I guess. And I started recalling those, and then pretty soon I just realized I had a book.
Well, in this latest book of yours, 10 Ohio Disasters, what I find fascinating is that while you talk about tragedies and often loss of life, there are these redeeming factors of humans coming forth to save humans, animals, and others. How did you select which ones were going to go into the book?
Well, that was kind of hard to do because it kind of evolved, I guess is the best way to put it. The second story that I worked on was the parachute disaster of 1967. And that one occurred when some skydivers here in northern Ohio wanted to go have a jump from 20,000 feet, which is up where the airliners fly. And they found this pilot of a B-25 bomber out in Wakeman, Ohio, who offered them a free ride on a Sunday afternoon to take them up that long to jump over the airport there. And what happened was that at the same time, a Cessna took off and was circling the airport to take pictures of the jump. And the air traffic controller at Oberlin, who was watching this on the radar, thought the Cessna was the bomber and started giving the directions to the Cessna. The Cessna never left the airport. The bomber, in the meantime, drifted out over Lake Erie. And there was a cloud deck there, and they shouldn't have let the jumpers jump, but they did. And 20 people were in the plane, 18 of them jumped. And when they hit the water down there, 16 of them didn't make it, and they drowned. And I was able to track down, I went and covered that story at the time in 1967, and I interviewed a man by the name of Bob Coy of Springfield, Ohio, who was one of the 2 survivors of the jump. And I know that night he told me, he said, "I'm never going to jump again." And I just sitting home here years later thinking, wonder whatever happened to him. And I tracked him down, took months, but when we did, Bob told me the story of what happened that day, and he also told me about the jump he finally did make afterwards, which was a final jump that he made. It was a really courageous story, and I wanted to repeat that.
Neil, some of the stories clearly you covered or happened while you were a reporter. But what is the process in writing for you? Do you save all of your notes and go back to them? How do you do all of this research?
Boy, I wish I had. That would have made things a lot easier if I had. In most cases, I have a good memory, which is great. In the stories that I was on, I do remember a lot of the facts. The ones I didn't, I had to go out and I finally dig into the old newspapers, magazines, in some cases films that were on YouTube and other places. But in every case that I could, I tried to find witnesses, people that were there, survivors, or people that took part in the original story, or even reporters that might have been there. And that was the process I used. And sadly, as we were starting to write the book, I started to lose my eyesight. And I was told that I had macular degeneration and it was going to go fairly fast. And so it became a race to get the book done before I could still see. And by the time it ended, I had become legally blind, and so I could no longer see the keyboard. So my wife, Bonnie, stepped in to help me, and she's just been amazing. I mean, she has to go through and do the research for me. She has to read the old articles to me. Then I would have to dictate what I wanted to write to her, and she had to type it back onto the script. And I will tell you, it's a laborious process. I don't recommend it to many people, but it worked for us.
Bonnie is a wonderful person.
Absolutely.
And clearly a great partner for you to have in your journey as a writer. What stories, were there any stories that you wanted to include in your list of 10 Ohio disasters that didn't make the cut?
There were several that I wanted to. I would have probably made it, 20 or 30 disasters if I'd had the time and the eyesight to do it. One of the stories was the fact that I believe I am probably the last reporter to have interviewed Martin Luther King Jr. before he was assassinated. It had happened here in Cleveland about 3 weeks or 4 weeks before the assassination. He came to town on a secret meeting where he met with some community leaders. I'm not sure who all they were. I got a tip during the day. I shouldn't say I got it. Both of us, Pete Carey, who was another reporter at the station, and I got the original tip. And both of us worked the phones all day trying to track him down where this meeting was. And we seemed like we were always just a little bit late. We finally discovered that he was going to be leaving town that afternoon at 5 o'clock at Hopkins Airport. So I took a camera crew and I went out and staked out the airport until he arrived. And he was a little surprised to see a reporter because he thought he was there being very hush-hush. He agreed to talk to me for a minute, but he didn't really tell me a lot. He just admitted that he was there for Operation Push, which was going on at the time. They were trying to get more black people into working in grocery stores at that point, and they were trying to use Operation Breadbasket, which is getting African Americans not to shop at these grocery stores that didn't employ them. And it seemed like a reasonable thing to me, but at the time it was not very reasonable, I guess. In any event, he said he'd be back in a few weeks and he'd have a big announcement on this. And I said goodbye to him, and we shook hands, and he walked off, and I never saw him again, of course, because a few weeks later he was assassinated. At Channel 8, they have the photo down there taken from that film of he and I standing there talking at that interview. I'd like to find some substantiation of what this meeting was and what more it was about, and because we couldn't, we didn't include the story.
But it's something that you're still working on. I know you'd like to find the answer.
I want to write a magazine article at least about it someday. It's not going to change any history or anything, but it just, a lot of people can say that they met Martin Luther King, but I just thought this is kind of special. I would like to prove it happened.
Oh, indeed, indeed. What else are you researching, and are you and Bonnie working on other stories?
Well, there's one story I'm working on, which it connects with my little car that I drove, my red and white Nash Metropolitan that we brought in the middle of the one-tank trip series. I drove it for nearly 10 years on the air, and we had a lot of adventures. My son Craig kind of grew up in the car. He was like 4 or 5 years old, and he used to come out in summer times, and he'd go with me on a lot of the one-tank trips. And people really kind of related to that red and white Nash. And when I retired the first time in 2004, the Canton Classic Car Museum asked to borrow the car and put it on display. So they've had it nearly 20 years. Well, unfortunately, they closed because of COVID. And so it was sitting down there not being used, and I'm reaching an age where I can't drive anymore, so there's a little chance I'll be back in the car again. And so it became, whether I sell the car or do I do something with it? And I finally decided to give it to my great-grandson. He was just born. He's only 4 months old. So instead, we're going to give it to my granddaughter, who is going to be his caretaker and guardian for the car. And they're going to have a lot of new adventures in it. But sadly, the car is now in central Ohio, down where they live.
You know we weren't going to let you get away one way or the other without finding out what happened to that little Nash. So I'm glad to hear it's still in the family.
I think every personal appearance I make, Bonnie and I have a joke about it, but we always have a bet. Is it going to be the first or the second question somebody's going to ask me? And it's usually but one of the two.
Very good. Neil, it's been a pleasure talking to you. We're glad to hear about the success for 10 Ohio disasters, and we know there are more stories coming from Neil Zurcher. Good to see you.
Eleanor, it's been a delight being with you once more. It really is.
We hope that you enjoyed what you've heard. We look forward to your comments. And don't forget to like and share.